Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here. I'm also a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. He's the Orrington Lunt Professor of Education and Social Policy and the Director of the Institute of Policy Research at Northwestern University. His name is Dr. David Figlio. Today's forum is part of our ongoing series on education and education reform and education innovation, all sponsored by the Nordson Corporation, by the way. Thank you. And perhaps one of the most contentious issues in education today is the proposition that public money ought to follow a student no matter where that student attends school. This is often referred to as voucher program, but it can also include scholarships funded with tax credits. The first school voucher program, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, was established in 1991 to give low-income families more high-quality school options. Shortly after that, school voucher programs were piloted in Florida, right here in Cleveland, Ohio, and other places. Today, there are 39 similar private school choice programs across the country. Ohio's statewide Educational Choice Scholarship Program, commonly known as EdChoice, provides students from underperforming public schools the opportunity to attend participating private schools. It's one of 5 voucher programs available in Ohio, the most of any state in the nation. And part of what we're doing here today is to hear about this particular report from the Fordham Foundation, the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is, and this report is authored by our speaker today, David Figlio, and I'm just going to go with Professor Karbownik, because that first name is, well, I think it's Christoph, but it's just got a lot of letters in it. At any rate, and this is an evaluation of the EdChoice program, and this report is available just outside the doors, and it's being released today, and you're probably among the first to hear about it. The effectiveness of school vouchers, of course, has been debated since their inception. Proponents of school vouchers assert these programs allow students from low-income families the opportunity to attend high-performing schools that they couldn't otherwise afford. Critics argue that school choice afforded by the vouchers actually hurts the students who remain behind and drains resources from public education. A fundamental question here, though, is this: do voucher programs actually benefit the students they are designed to help? Another question is, could both of those things actually be true? There is perhaps no more authoritative voice in the school voucher debate than Dr. Figlio's. He's studied one of the nation's largest and most expansive voucher programs, the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. His resulting studies have been cited in school choice and voucher debates from New Hampshire and Pennsylvania to Virginia and Washington, D.C., and even as far afield as Sweden and Australia. In addition to school vouchers, Dr. Figlio conducts research on a wide range of education and health policy issues, from school accountability and standards to welfare policy and policy design. He's also leading a National Science Foundation-sponsored national network to facilitate the use of matched administrative data sets to inform and evaluate education policy. Dr. Figlio has been at Northwestern since 2008. Prior to that, he was at the University of Florida, where he was the Knight Ridder Professor of Economics. He received his bachelor degree in business economics and public policy from George Washington University and his graduate degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Figlio. You got some water right there, too.
Oh, perfect. Super. All right. I don't want to hurt your furniture, so I'll put this down here. Pardon me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As we were talking just before, I learned about the auspicious history of this organization. It's certainly one that I absolutely, as a member of the Academy, feel very, very strongly about. The notion that one should come in with no preconceived answers or about any contentious question, and that we let evidence be our guide. And for those of you who are either a strong voucher proponent or opponent, I think you'll probably find my talk today to be particularly unsatisfying. Because what you'll see, right, is that we're it's very much a mixed bag, just like pretty much every policy that one wants to study. A lot of my work involves questions regarding optimal policy design, and I think along the way I'll give you a couple of little tidbits, even though I'm talking especially today about the Ohio EdChoice program. I have looked at voucher programs elsewhere, and especially in Florida. And so along the way, and also in the Q&A, I'd be happy to do some comparisons and contrasts of that. So thanks very much for your invitation and for your attention. Voucher programs have been rather in vogue recently in the United States. A couple of decades ago, there were very few. Today, more than half of all states have at least some mechanisms for using taxpayer money to have kids attend private schools. It's very rare that you hear people talking these days about universal voucher programs, but people are much more comfortable talking about what we call targeted voucher programs. So these are voucher programs that are intended to support students from particular disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, who may or may not have much in the way of choice within the traditional public school setting, or maybe people who are zoned to or have been attending schools that higher ups have deemed to be low performing. Those types of policies are considerably more popular these days. So that's a little bit of the backdrop behind this. As was mentioned, proponents of school voucher programs will say that these programs are offering students from disadvantaged backgrounds access to schools they couldn't afford otherwise. Proponents also will frequently talk about how vouchers can unleash the magic of the market, in which you can have, by having more competition, that can mean that a rising tide might lift all boats. Opponents of school vouchers will focus often on what happens to the public schools. If we're taking kids away from the public schools, bringing them to the private schools, they're bringing money with them. This could be hurting the students who are left behind, leaving schools with fewer resources, fewer opportunities, etc. This is a very complicated question, and since every program is different, this is one reason why it's so important for us to see what's actually happening in Ohio with the EdChoice program. As was introduced, there are now 5 different voucher programs in Ohio. I'm focusing on the school voucher program, which is tied to schools that the state has deemed low performing. It does not include the Cleveland program, which is a separate voucher program, for example. It also does not focus on the brand new, relatively brand new in research time at least, program that's focused on low income students. So I just want to let you know what I'm studying and what I'm not studying. I think it's useful to think about a few different questions. Whenever we're interested in school vouchers, and I apologize for people in Radio Land if we end up doing that, they have 2 slides with text on them here, but then there are going to be a couple of slides with figures, because this is a very number-rich presentation. So there are 3 major questions that people who are interested in school vouchers often are asking. One is the question, okay, well, what happens when students have the opportunity to attend a private school? Who goes? And of course, in this particular question, for example, we know a number of different things. So the EdChoice program requires that students successfully obtain admission to a private school before they apply for a voucher. So what this means, right, is that you have a set of students who have sought out a private school, obtained admission to the private school, and then obtained access to a voucher. That's not the way it happens in a lot of different places, and I'll talk about that later. But that's an interesting question then. Who goes through those various steps? The second question is, what's happening to the reading and math performance of students who remain in traditional public schools? Of course, we're interested fundamentally in many more questions than reading and math performance. However, reading and math performance are the things that are easily measurable using universally collected data. And so, obviously, this is just a tiny fraction of the set of outcomes we really care about, ranging from college and career readiness to how good of a citizen you are to self-concept and satisfaction with your life, etc. We can't measure most of those things, certainly not with administrative data. And so this is one of the somewhat unsatisfying things that happens with large-scale education research, is that we're often limited to this. Now, that said, we do care about students' numeracy and literacy. They are highly predictive of long-term outcomes we care about, like high school graduation, like college attendance and completion, like labor market outcomes, like staying out of jail, like civic participation as adults, all of the things that we all care about. But it's just an indicator. But that said, it's one indicator out of many, and that's the only thing we're really able to measure. And then the other one is, so that's looking at the kids who are remaining in the public schools. How about the kids who move to the private schools? What are the effects of EdChoice participation on the reading and math performance of students going to private schools? Now, the first question is very easy to study. It's just descriptive. We can take a look at numbers. You don't need specialized training to be able to measure, to be able to answer that first question about when students have the opportunities to go, who goes? The other two questions are much harder to study, and you can't just go and say things like that last question, for example. What's the effect of participation on reading and math performance? It's tempting to say, let's take a look at the kids who are participating in the program and the kids who are not participating in the program, just compare the two. But that's not the way we want to study that, because if you just compare one group to another, you're assuming that it was random that some of these kids were participating in the program, but we know it's not random. There are all different reasons why people might be participating. In some regards, if it was random, first question would be pretty boring, right? Because there would be nothing special about about the students. It was just a coin flip. Well, we know that there are lots of different reasons why people choose to go to a private school. Lots of different reasons why they may be eligible to go to a private school, et cetera. And so you can't, in order to make an apples to apples comparison, that's where you have to start slicing and dicing the data in particular ways. And I promise you, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on statistics, but it is useful, I think, when you're evaluating evidence, including my own, to think about what are the assumptions that we've made when we're trying to come to the conclusions that we've come to. By the way, in case you want to know how to pronounce my co-author's first name, since you all like basketball, I understand, in Cleveland. Most people in one of the most famous names in basketball actually looks very similar to that. It's Coach Krzyzewski at Duke. So now you know that you can pronounce my co-author's first name. It's Krzysztof, because that's how you get figure out all those Z's. All right, so I don't know much about basketball, so I figured that was a great opportunity to congratulate you. I understand there's other things that are happening in the city sometime soon as well. All right, so I'll just give you a little bit of a timeline now, and then we'll move on. So in June 2005, the Educational Choice Scholarship Pilot Program was put into place. It took effect in 06-07, and it was limited to a very small set of schools. Those schools who were assigned so-called academic emergency status 3 years in a row. This was a very small amount. Before this actually even took place, in spring 2006, the rules were relaxed so that it was academic emergency or academic watch, the two lowest levels, the D or F, for 3 consecutive years. And in the 2006-2007 school year, just over 3,000 students from 99 traditional public schools ended up attending private schools under this program. In December of 06, the eligibility criteria were further relaxed. Now you could be academic emergency or academic watch in 2 out of 3 years. And so in 2007-2008, the number of students eligible went up by a fair amount. The number of students participating more than doubled. That should be 213 schools, not 2,013 schools. And now by 2013-14, now we were up to 18,000. Now over 20,000 students participating in the program. And in 1314, the program was expanded to include economically disadvantaged students as well. Now, I'm showing you this timeline because the timeline is very important. In order to get credible estimates of those questions I was asking, you need to look back in history a bit. And we're going to take advantage of these, frankly, idiosyncratic program rules. Now, idiosyncrasy is not great necessarily for public policy, but it's fantastic for research. And the reason it's good for research is that you can start to find people who are very similar in a lot of different ways. And the fact, for example, that we look at the 2 out of 3 years being academic emergency or academic watch makes it very, very easy to start to come up with apples to apples comparisons. So because of that, almost all the data that I'm going to be presenting for you today and the data that I believe the most has to do with the genesis of the program, that second year of participation in 07-08, in which there was this massive change in the program that we're taking advantage of. That reduces somewhat the excitement from a policy discussion, because now we're looking at water far under the bridge. But if the idea here is we want to first try to get some benchmark as far as what were the effects using the most credible ways we can possibly try to do it, that's the reason I'm doing that. All right, I think that's the only technical stuff I'm going to talk about. So let me share with you some results in the next 15 minutes. So the first question, right, is this question about who chooses the program. And of course, right, there's a lot of things that we mean by who chooses, right? This is a person who had to find a private school, want to go to a private school, find a private school, obtain admission to the private school, and then receive a voucher. All right, now what we're seeing here is the prior reading performance. You can look in the report, which is readily available. You can see for prior math performance as well. These are the participants versus those who are remaining in the public school. By the way, everything you're seeing with test scores are standardized. So the mean in the state of Ohio is 0, and the standard deviation is 1. So you can imagine that like a standard deviation is like 150 SAT points type of thing, just to give you a little bit of a sense as to something. I have a kid who's going off to college in Oregon, by the way, in the fall. So we're all thinking about the SAT or ACT, right? So the first thing you notice here is the solid line. I'm sorry again for people listening. The solid line up top are the kids who are going to the private schools. These are in any of the given years in the program, and the dashed line below are the kids who were eligible but remained. And the first thing you can see here is that the set of kids who are going to private. First of all, these are low-performing schools on average, right? And so this means that the typical kid attending these schools is performing much worse than the state average. But conditional on being in one of those schools, the relatively high-performing students in reading, and the same thing's true for math, are the ones who are going to the private schools under the program. And we can see that both for overall as well as in your first year of eligibility, that again, the patterns are such that the set of kids who are going to the private schools are comparatively high performing relative to the set of eligible kids who are staying in the public schools. Now, we also can look at economically disadvantaged. And in the report, I share a bunch of different things too, but we don't have a lot of time for that. So economically disadvantaged, again, the next thing to notice is that these are schools that are overwhelmingly low-income schools. These are not rich schools serving rich populations. So, but then also, if you look at the typical student, over 90% of the kids who are eligible but remain in the public schools, traditional public schools, were economically disadvantaged. But the share is more like 10 percentage points smaller for those who are going to the private schools under the program. So again, the kids who are going to private schools under the program are slightly more advantaged, though still disproportionately economically disadvantaged, and considerably higher performing than their counterparts who were eligible to participate but weren't going. Now, I'll mention briefly that in the state of Florida, where I studied extensively extensively, these lines were reversed. And one of the reasons in Florida why the lines were reversed is that in Florida, participation was based on, categorically based on economic disadvantage. You had to be economically disadvantaged, but then everybody who was economically disadvantaged was eligible. Now, why would that then lead to this reversal? Well, I think part of the reason behind that was that if you look in Florida, then there are lots of economically disadvantaged students in A schools and also lots of economically disadvantaged kids in F schools. And so there was no link between the nature of the school kids were going to and their eligibility, like there is in Ohio. The other thing then we see in Florida, which is kind of an interesting thing, is that the application process was reversed. So in Florida, you first apply for a voucher. Once you receive a voucher, then you can choose. Then you apply to private school. And so I think that again, this is my professional judgment rather than me speaking on behalf of any other organization. But my professional judgment is one of the reasons we probably see this reversal between Florida and Ohio is that in Florida, it's much easier for disadvantaged kids to access the private sector through the voucher program than it is in Ohio. Now, that's something that in a couple of years, you'll be able to study this looking at the more recent data, and I look forward to somebody doing that because I think that will help to see whether or not when you release one but not two of these differences, how does that change? Okay, So that's the first piece of information. Now, moving on to the second piece of information, we're interested in looking at the question of what's the effect of participation on, what's the effect of EdChoice eligibility on traditional public school performance. All right, so now the way in which we want to do this, right, is we want to try to come up with an apples to apples comparison. We can't just go, if you were to just go and look at the public school performance of all the EdChoice eligible schools and the public school performance of all the ineligible schools, you would get a pretty false comparison, right? Why? Because the schools that are eligible become eligible on the basis of measures of their performance. Now, it's debatable as to whether that's the best measure of performance, but it is an indicator of school performance. And if you were to go and compare these, you'd be comparing a set of schools that the state called not so good to a set of schools that the state called much better. Well, I think we all know what that comparison would look like, but that's not the effect of the policy. That's the effect of all sorts of things that tie together, from things that the schools are doing to things that are related to the background, financial capacity of local communities. All sorts of different things could explain those differences. So how do we go about dealing with that? Well, I'm going to use one or two technical terms in this talk. I'm going to use a term called regression discontinuity. I promise I can explain that to you in a sentence or two. So the idea behind it, in order to come up with an apples-to-apples comparison, is you want to find two schools that are basically identical, but for the fact that the kids in that school became eligible for the voucher, and the other, they didn't. So basically what you want to do is line all the schools up along some continuum and then find some place where there's some discrete change that's arbitrary. Well, you can't get more arbitrary than what most states end up doing, which is they had to draw a line somewhere. And there were two different things that were arbitrary. And by arbitrary, I don't mean bad. I just mean you have to draw a line somewhere, right? So just like we draw, all sorts of different things for allocation. So the state, first of all, decided to draw a line somewhere for academic watch. That could have been anywhere, but it was a particular place. And then the fact that in that second year of the program, they changed it so it was the 2 out of 3. That means you're lining up against their second best score. And are you just over the line or just under the line in terms of the second best school with academic watch? It becomes much clearer. So then with what you do with regression discontinuity, and there's some pretty pictures, for a data geek, pretty pictures in there that you can look at. You can line everybody up. You can see what the growth is in test scores. You can get at some underlying relationship between the second best score
And you can see whether there's a discrete jump in performance that happens at exactly the place where some kids become eligible for the voucher and other kids don't. And that's what we did. So I'm not going to show you those pictures. But you can look it up in the publicly available report. What I am going to show you are some summation. Now, the thing that you want to do, right, is I never trusted if somebody comes and says, here's the one answer to your question, then they're trying to sell you something, right? What I think is a much better thing to do is to say, I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways you can tackle this problem with all sorts of different assumptions about these relationships, because nobody really knows the true relationship. We're just trying to estimate it. And we're trying to estimate it, just like, for example, maybe you're interested in presidential politics. Sometimes people look at a particular poll and they say, look, so-and-so is up by X points. But what a lot of people in the political science and the research world like to think of is like the average of a moving average of these polls, looking at a whole bunch of different things, because one poll could be a real crazy outlier. So I'll let you judge for yourself. I'm not going to do the average, but I'm going to show you a bunch of different approaches. So you don't have to look at anything here, any of the words at all. These are here are 12 different ways in which you could slice the data in order to come up with different assumptions. And the first thing to notice is the solid, again, sorry for people listening, but again, you can see this in the report. The solid bars are those that are statistically significant at conventional levels, but then just because something's not statistically significant at a conventional level doesn't mean it's not meaningful. So I like to ghost the other bar. So what we see here is that for reading growth, these are individual students. Again, doing this apples to apples comparison. In 11 out of the 12 cases here, what we see is positive and statistically significant effects on the public schools. Now, how big are these numbers? These aren't huge. 0.07, 0.09 of a standard deviation. What does that mean in English? Well, around a tenth of a standard deviation is the amount of higher performance we usually see if your mom has an extra year of education. So this is maybe like 2/3 or so of that number. So it's sizable. It's not earth-shattering, but it's positive. And one thing that I think is kind of interesting about that, right, is that a lot of people who are immediately concerned about, oh gosh, is this going to be crushing the public schools? Here's some evidence that might be a little bit comforting, right? That again, there's lots of reasons that might not be measured here, but at least here's one dimension. This is reading. Math, it's the same type of thing. Again, the numbers bounce around a bit, but again, it's hard to call this negative. For that. So those are some. Now, this is the first year. What happens 2 years in after this? The results start to get a little smaller. But again, there's one negative estimate, but it's not statistically significant. The preponderance of the evidence continues to be positive. And of course, one of the things that's happening in this 2 years in is that some of the comparison schools have now become eligible as well. And some of the schools that were eligible have now moved out of eligibility. So in general, the point here is that even 2 years out, we're still seeing generally positive estimates for reading and also for math. Again, it depends whether this is how big it is depends on the specification. But again, what I'm thinking about is from the optimistic point of view is as I'm looking at this, I see very little evidence that the Earth is moving in a massive way, right? In terms of if we're thinking that this is revolutionizing public schooling in Ohio, I think again, you've been sold something. But it does seem like on average, there's this positive and persistent result that we see much more often than not. And we certainly are not seeing a negative result for the public schools. We also, in the report, I do differences by subgroup as well. I'm not going to do that because I think I have about 4 minutes to share with you some stuff about the last thing, and I want to have plenty of time for Q&A. So there's just some subgroup analysis that I'll skip here. So that now I can move on, but I'll hold that open until I launch the participant effects. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold, so I apologize that you're listening to that. Excuse me. So for participant effects, it's the same type of thing, same type of fundamental empirical challenge that we see for the competitive effects, right? The effects on the public schooling. For participant effects, what we're interested in is we want to make an apples-to-apples comparison. Comparing a kid who's attending a private school under the EdChoice voucher program versus a kid who is identical to that kid but didn't. Well, now you can imagine the first thing you might think about doing is just looking at the kids in the school who are eligible to participate and just compare those who did and those who didn't. But again, that's not the best way to do this, right? And the reason it's not the best way to do this is because there's a reason why the kids who are participating. And there's a reason why the kids who aren't participating are not participating. And we don't know that reason. And so we'd be making very heroic assumptions if we just said, okay, we surely have solved this problem. So what do we do as a second best? We want to go, and Ohio is a great place to study this because Ohio, not every kid is eligible to participate in the program. In the case of Florida, every low-income student is eligible to participate in the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program, which means that you really have to do a lot of gymnastics in order to make a credible claim that we can make an apples-to-apples comparison. In Ohio, there was this kind of, again, funny, somewhat arbitrary system, which meant that some schools that were nearly identical to one another, the kids were eligible or the kids were not eligible. So we can go and find every kid who's participating in the voucher program and then find the kid who looks identical in all the observables, their past history, the school measures of school quality and that type of thing, but is just over the line in the ineligible schools. And then we're saying, okay, it's a lot easier to believe that we found the kid who's observationally equivalent because here's a kid who is not eligible but has all sorts of background factors that make them look like they're the same. And it's easy in a big state like Ohio to find matched pairs for every single kid participating in the private schools. All right, now what does this mean? So here's the second bit of statistical lingo I want to share, but it's an important one. So there's a tension between what we call internal validity and what we call external validity. Internal validity basically means credibility. So we want to be able to say, this is the most credible way we can think of to make an apples-to-apples comparison. But notice but in order to do that, the price we pay is we have to look at only the set of schools, kids in schools, very close to that margin of the schools that just barely made it, just barely missed being voucher eligible. What does this mean? We can't say anything credible about the kids who are far away from that threshold. So we're looking at the highest rate. We can only look at the kids leaving the highest rated public schools conditional on being eligible, if you're with me. We can't look at the others, and that's a major shortcoming of what we're able to do. But we decided we wanted, as a first pass, to try to get at the best possible, the most credible estimate of the thing we could estimate. So now the big reveal, right? Notice how before I was talking about a positive treatment effect for the public schools. Well, there's a negative treatment effect that we estimate for the kids who are participating. And not only that, but those are not small numbers, right? These are numbers. Again, these are different. Don't pay attention to the various things. These are different ways in which you can slice and dice the data. But the takeaway message from this is that the negative estimated effects on the kids who are participating is 2, 3, 4 times the positive estimated effects for the kids as a whole, the public school kids as a whole. Now, of course, there are many, many, many more kids, public school kids, who are not participating than private school kids who are participating. All right, I see some furrowed brows. How could it be possible that this program can have such negative estimated effects? Well, the first possibility is that the kids are going to lousy schools on average. That's certainly possible, right? But there are a couple of other explanations that aren't necessarily so negative, right? So one thing is that these are tests that are the same tests administered to the public school students and the private school students, right? Well, one of those groups of schools has a much stronger incentive to perform well on these tests than the other group of schools, right? The state has accountability incentives. The public schools curricula, the tests are aligned to curricula for the public schools. Sometimes one of the reasons that I know from surveying thousands of parents in Florida who chose the voucher in Florida is many parents in Florida, at least, and I bet the same is true in Ohio. They're both purple states. Many parents report that they want to avoid testing, or they don't like all the testing that's happening in the test prep. And so that could be one reason why people are actually choosing private schools. You might imagine the private schools that aren't focusing as much on these tests might not do as well on the tests, all else equal. Or maybe they want a different curriculum. Now, again, that could be a positive, that could be a negative. To the degree to which the test measures the types of things we really want kids to know, then maybe a different curriculum is not so great. But if the test is measuring only a tiny fraction of the things we want kids to know, then maybe it's a different story. And then finally, of course, another possible explanation, right, is that these are just what happens when you're leaving the comparatively very best, according to the state, schools. And maybe we'd see a different result if you were leaving the worst schools. And that's something we don't know. We can't pick out any of those different types of things. All I know is it's got to be some combination of these. And this is where I view this as the beginning rather than the end of study. I think that I personally hope that the state and members of the media and school districts, et cetera, will try to do a deep dive into which of these three types of explanations might be the thing going on. And that could involve both quantitative and qualitative results. I showed you reading scores, lest you think that was really special. Here's math scores. It's even worse. So the numbers are even a little bit bigger for math scores. You might be saying, one thing I didn't say yet is that it could be the case that kids are one reason why you might imagine there could be a difference. By the way, one thing I didn't show you here is this is the first year, the second year, and the third year the kids are in the school. So in the year before they were in the school, they were at 0. Now they're way below, right? So you might say, kids, there's a transition cost to changing schools, and that sticks with you. Well, fine. Let's compare that to the public schools where kids transition at odd times. And so the lines at the bottom are what we see for the private schools, and the lines we see at the top are the ones we see for the public schools. So yes, one thing you do see is that part of this gap is due to the fact that we see, I'm sorry, wait, I misspoke. That was the cold medication. This is comparing the participants to public school movers directly. So even when you're comparing to the public school movers, we're seeing these negative results, which is suggesting that it's not just kids who change schools, it's something special about the different things. Again, I'm not ready or willing to say that it's because the schools these kids are going to are worse, but it's some combination of a bunch of different factors. These are looking at the initial set, but we can look at more recent cohorts as well. And so if we load up all the different cohorts and look at their first year in the program, second year in the program, third year in the program, the patterns look nearly identical. So I'm already over time. So let me just conclude, and so we can have some questions. So what are my takeaways? You may have different ones, but here are my takeaway messages. The first is that almost every eligible student is economically disadvantaged, but comparatively, the kids who participate in the EdChoice program are comparatively more advantaged and better performing relative to those who are eligible don't participate. That's the first thing. While not definitive, the weight of the evidence strongly indicates, in my opinion, that students becoming eligible for EdChoice scholarships improved the public schools they were attending. So that's kind of the thing that, for the voucher advocates, is the good takeaway message. Now, the good takeaway message for the voucher opponents is next, right? The set of kids who actually go to the private schools do a lot worse. Now, is that specious? That is it due to the fact that public schools are more responsive to these tests, for example, than the private schools, et cetera? some of it has got to be true. I've spent a lot of my career studying all the ways public schools try to look good on the tests, including changing policies and practices in the way. That's the whole reason for the whole accountability movement, is that you'd have a measurement and then schools would respond. And it makes sense that schools that are responsive to the test might do better on the tests. We don't know which of these things are true. The one thing I don't think you should go away and tweet or tell your friends is that I don't think it's reasonable to say that the kids who went into the private schools got shellacked by the program. The truth has to be more nuanced than that. And of course, part of that nuance is we had to make use of data early in the program's history to credibly identify policy effects. So with that, I guess we'll just open it up for questions, right?
Yes, 1 second. Yes, please.
Oh, thanks.
Do a little transition here.
Okay, there we go. Absolutely.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a forum with Dr. David Figlio, the Orrington Lunt Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. We are about to begin the Q&A, as the professor said, and we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, and all of you here, and those of you joining us via our live web stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, whether you're joining us remotely or you're in the room and you'd prefer not to speak up, that's fine too. Please tweet your question at the City Club, and our staff will work it into the program. We also want to remind you, too, that your questions should be brief and to the point, and not the kind of thing that is just sort of makes a statement and then ends with, "Don't you think that's true?" Holding our microphone today is Content Coordinator Teddy Eisenberg. Teddy, can we have our first question, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Merle Johnson, and I'm a candidate for the Ohio State School Board. And the reason that I'm running, one of the reasons I'm running, is because of programs like school vouchers and charters that continue to drain money from our public schools and then expect our public schools to do well, which makes no sense. So my concern is that not one time did you mention religion being a reason that parents are choosing school vouchers. Back when vouchers first entered the picture in Ohio, the Americans for separation of church and state were one of the loudest voices fighting against it. So what is the figure? I saw 80%. What is the correct figure of schools that actually are religious schools, and isn't that a reason that parents are choosing to go to these schools with tax dollars?
Thanks for your question. I'll answer this in a couple of different ways. Still briefly though, don't worry. I wasn't really able to study that question directly in the case of Ohio, but I'll now speak to information we know about from other places. So first of all, it's absolutely the case. I don't know the precise number, but somewhere between 3/4 and 4/5 of students are attending religious private schools, largely parochial schools, although not exclusively, religious private schools on this program. The same was true in Florida, which I've studied more extensively. In Florida, I carried out a very extensive survey of parents who were participating, as well as parents who were eligible but did not participate. And religion did come up as a major driver. So when people were asked, why are the reasons you want to choose another, why are the reasons you wanted to go to a private school? Invariably, for most cases, 3 or 4 different things came up more often than not. One was about academics. They felt like not necessarily the private school had better academics, although sometimes people said that. Sometimes it was a different academics, different curriculum. One privilege that affluent people have is they get a chance to choose amongst many different public school options. I live in Chicago metropolitan area. There are 150 different school districts that I can choose from, and I can buy into almost any of them with my professor salary. But disadvantaged families often have a lot less choice. And I think that's especially true for disadvantaged families of color who have historically been discriminated against in the housing market. So sometimes people talk about academic choice, the philosophical arguments of academic choice as an explanation. But right on the tails of that, tail of that are two other things. Sometimes people talk about safety and security, and just as many people talk about religion. So a good number of students, I don't have a number at the top of my head, I'm going to say, though, at least a quarter of families who are choosing this, religion is the primary reason they're choosing that. Now, I'll leave it to other people to think about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. From a scholarly perspective, I don't have a position on whether using taxpayer money to fund people going to religious schools is good or bad, but that's a political issue that people should talk about. Some people may say, okay, what matters is we're interested in funding students to go to school. In other cases, people may say we really want to make sure that there's this is only non-religious schools or only public schools, and that's an area for politics. So I admire the fact that people who are interested in running for the school board are having those types of conversations. Sure.
Hi, thank you so much for your research. It is really incredible to hear. I'm curious about what your gut feeling is. I mean, I know you've done a lot of research, but your gut feeling about using a market-based perspective to apply to public education. I know we've seen over and over again that the market-based perspective doesn't work with police department, fire department. So what's your gut feeling about having that perspective on public education?
So market-based, I'm an economist by training, and so a lot of times the biggest proponents of market-based reforms in education like to focus on one part of the competitive model that we see in Econ 101, but forget some of the other parts of it. So one thing that we know is that from Econ 101 is that if you have free entry and exit into the market, free entry into the market, free exit from the market, free choice, we should have the efficient outcome. Now, but then, of course, there are a lot of things that are behind the scenes that are assumptions that we make that we teach our students so they get conveniently sometimes forgotten. One is perfect information. We need to know exactly, in order to make the market model work, according to Econ 101, we have to have complete information. We need to have truly free entry and exit. And those types of things are the grease which makes the competitive market go. Well, in reality, we're far away from that, right? We don't have perfect information about schools. People don't have complete access to all sorts of different choices. There's not perfect free entry and exit. All of those things are limitations. And so with all of those things being limitations, that's immediately going to be moving away from the perfect world. The second thing then is a question, the second part of this then is a question of, that's theory, what happens in practice. In practice is that educational institutions are made up of people, and people are not automatons. People do lots of different things, and sometimes people actually don't do what is in one person's conception of their self-interest. And sometimes people behave in manners that don't seem rational in a particular way, or maybe they have more information about what is rational for them, etc. And that's true for every actor in this, from the teachers to the school administrators to school boards to parents, etc. So all of those are reasons that there could be limitations to the market mechanism. All right. Now, with all of those provisos, which are telling you reasons not to really trust the market mechanism, I will say that there's a good number of examples of ways in which market mechanisms have produced, I would call them, modest wins in education. So one place where there's a modest win has to do with school accountability. So there is evidence that suggests that under a number of different ways, if we go and evaluate schools on the basis of their performance, some measure of performance, even if you don't assign carrots and sticks to it, that schools end up doing better objectively along certain types of dimensions. There's also equally strong evidence that one of the ways in which they do better is often by gaming the system, doing all sorts of things. But one thing that we've learned is that you can go and design accountability systems in a way that maximizes the likelihood they're going to make productive changes and minimizes the likelihood that they're going to engage in these types of gaming the system. Given that this is lunch, I'll give one example of that, right? So one really good example of that is it turns out that if schools are evaluated on a proficiency threshold, where the goal is you're rated on the fraction of kids who get above some standard. It turns out that one thing that schools actually have learned how to do is juice kids' school meals. So it turns out, this is a fun fact for those of you who ever want to get ready for some big thing. Just like athletes who carbo load before a race end up doing really well, you actually can carbo load right before a test as well. And for about 90 to 150 minutes after the massive sugar intake, you actually are operating at a higher level of brain performance. Schools realized that and manipulated kids' calorie intake, and it actually worked in Virginia, which is a place where I studied that. Well, now think about what would happen if instead of this performance threshold, we were evaluating schools on the basis of their gains from one year to the next. Now think about the school that's giving kids an extra 100 calories this year. Well, now they know that next year they have to give kids 200 calories more, and the year after that it has to be 300 calories more, and so on. And what we find is actually, when schools are evaluated on the basis of gain scores, measures of value added, as opposed to proficiency thresholds, they're much less likely to do the gaming of the system because it's much harder to know. That sounded pejorative, and I don't mean it to be pejorative. They're less likely to respond to incentives to manipulate kids' test scores in manners that may not be educationally productive. They'll be less likely to do that than when it's an easy target to meet. So my view is I am not opposed to market-based mechanisms in education, be they school choice mechanisms or accountability mechanisms. I think that if we're going to have market-based mechanisms, we need to think very carefully about the incentives, try to figure out ways to design the policies in manners that are going to maximize the good things that could happen from the market, minimize the bad things that could happen from the market, and be realistic about our expectations about what could happen, because there's no silver bullet out there. So I really appreciate the question.
Hi. I have questions about the data that shows the modest benefit to the public schools.
Okay.
And I noticed that, and I understand why, that you're looking at those early years in the program. But when the numbers you put up at the beginning showed that the numbers who participated in those early years were fairly small, and that they've increased significantly in recent years. My concern about the program is that the impacts that it has on the public school are system-wide. They're not really on individuals, because it's about the dollars and the resources, the kids who are in the classroom. Those are larger systems. And it would make sense to me that as the numbers increase, that the impact would change. And as they become more statistically significant, it would change over time. So I guess I kind of have two questions. The first would be, do you have any indication, looking at the more recent data, of how those numbers may be changing as those numbers of kids who participate are more statistically significant? The second piece was you've commented on how public schools, especially in those years that you've showed the data for, have been under increased pressure to teach to the test, to align curriculum to the test, all of those things. When you see that improvement for those kids over those years, in the beginning years of the program, what level of improvement would you have expected to see based on that kind of alignment and that kind of pressure to increase test scores in schools across the state who maybe don't fall into that academic watch, that academic emergency status? Were scores going up across the board because of those efforts to improve test scores? And how does that compare to the improvements that you see in the EdChoice schools?
So those are great questions. I'll address the second one first, because that one's the easier one to talk about. So the thing that's nice about this regression discontinuity approach that we take with this is that we could rule out anything that's happening system-wide. So everything that's going on for all the schools in the state is totally taken out of the equation. And not only that, but everything that's, you might imagine that the very high performing schools may have different incentives than the schools kind of in the middle. And so anything that is common to the schools right around that watch threshold, which I would imagine all of them would be feeling a lot of those pressures you're talking about, all of that is taken out of the equation. The second thing I'll mention with that is that whereas I haven't studied this particular question in Ohio, I have studied this question in Florida, in which I carried out some very extensive surveys of the universe of all the public school principals in the state of Florida over a series of years. And my co-authors, this was Cecilia Rouse at Princeton, Jane Hanaway at Georgetown, and Dan Goldhaber at University of Washington, and I found that we wanted to look at, can we see evidence that schools are making substantive changes to instructional policies and practices as well? So we got together a group of a dozen of the country's leading experts, left and right and center, to help us design these surveys. What we ended up finding was that the substantive measures that we were able to pick up on these surveys explain somewhere between 50 and 75% of the gains. So what that means, right, is that some of the gains we were seeing was due to, in thinking about the previous question, right, due to teaching to the test or other types of things, or maybe weaknesses in our survey questions. But 50 to 75% can be explainable by the things that we were picking up from the surveys. So that makes me feel a little bit more bullish that even though I can't go and say the same thing was definitely true in Ohio, it's not that Ohio's environment was that dissimilar from Florida's. So that makes me feel a little more confident that at least a good amount of those changes were genuine. The first question you had, I think, is a more significant concern. What happens when the size of the program grows? Now, the size of the program is still very small relative to the set of people who are eligible for the program. And so my gut, because I can't say this definitively, my gut, having studied this in other locales, is that we haven't gotten to a place where we would have reached a tipping point. Now, maybe there are some schools for which we have. But if we're talking about in general, maybe 3 to 5% of the eligible population, which is what we're really talking about here, that's still a pretty small number. But I think I would feel very uncomfortable with using this, especially research like this, to say advocate for a doubling or tripling of the size of the program without trying to do some serious dives into what's happening more recently. So I think it's a reasonable concern. I think I'm not as concerned as you are, but I think it's absolutely reasonable. And it says one last question, right? No, I think this is we're it? One quick. One quick? One more. Very good.
Okay, I'm not sure mine is quick.
Uh-oh.
But, it's actually, it is a concern. It may be quick because you might not have an answer to it. But I am concerned about voter support for public education and how EdChoice plays into that. And I know that in the diverse inner ring public school district that these two tables represent, we have a large population of parents who have no intention of using our schools, whether they are successful or not, because they intend to send their kids to parochial or Orthodox Jewish schools. And my concern is that those people may be choosing to vote against our schools in things like school levies, which is the unfortunate way we fund our schools in the state of Ohio, and that would be with the intention of directly financially benefiting themselves, because they know that if a school levy fails, that certain cuts need to be made, particularly to those people in support positions who may be most likely to help disadvantaged children succeed, and that then test scores may go down and schools may fall into EdChoice, and therefore those families can benefit from the financial benefit of that. And so I'm wondering if that concerns you, and if there is a way to look at that in terms of data.
So,
You've got 30 seconds.
okay, so So there's no empirical evidence to support the specific thing you said. However, there is empirical evidence that does say that people do tend to have less support for public schools that they don't intend to send their children to. We see that also with intergenerational questions. Grandparents are more likely to support schools if their grandkids live in the same community. So I don't think you need to go nearly all the way down the road that you went down in order to have a comparative concern. How about that?
That's great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Here, have a seat. and
Thank
we'll wrap
you.
it up. That was the briefest answer to the longest question I've ever heard. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a wonderfully insightful forum with Dr. David Figlio of Northwestern University. Dr. Figlio appears as part of our Education Innovation Series, which is sponsored by the Nordson Corporation. We thank you very much for your continued support. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by Cleveland Heights University, Heights City School District, and the Northeastern Ohio Education Association. We thank you very much for joining us and for your partnership. That brings us to the end of today's program. Thank you, Dr. Figlio. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.